Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Allowing a minute here for everyone to start joining in and getting into the presentation. Um, Good morning. Good morning. If you wouldn't mind, please put in your name, your organization in the chat so we can know where you're from and the county you're representing. All right. So going ahead and just getting us started today, we have one of our trainings on crisis intervention and de-escalation strategies and techniques. We have three wonderful presenters that are going to be sharing their knowledge and experience with you all. We have Cindy Corolla, Angela Castellanos, and Kathy Madenwald, who will be presenting on this crisis training or crisis intervention and de-escalation training. And this project is in support, or this presentation is in support of that Mobile Crisis Services, the new BIN that came out. Mobile Crisis Services provide a rapid response, including assessment and community-based stabilization to Medi-Cal beneficiaries who are experiencing a behavioral health crisis. Mobile Crisis Services are designed to provide relief to beneficiaries experiencing a behavioral health crisis, including through de-escalation and stabilization techniques. We want to really help them reduce the immediate risk of danger and subsequent harm and avoid unnecessary emergency department care, psychiatric and patient hospitalizations, and law enforcement involvement. And this is all notated and highlighted in the BIN Notice 23-025. And again, welcome to today's session. Hope everyone's here for the right one. I'm sure it is. It's a crisis intervention, de-escalation strategies and techniques. And here are our presenters, Cindy Garola, Angela Castellanos, and Kathy Madenwald, who will be taking it over from here.
Thank you so much, David, for the wonderful introductions. And I see this beautiful waterfall of folks joining us this morning. So thank you for spending Friday morning with us today. So we're hoping that we're going to be, providing you with lots of really good information. And so as I'm listening or watching the chat right now, I'll, give an opportunity for folks to write in their takeaways for today. Well, let's talk a little bit about the learning objectives. The hope is that today, the purpose again is to provide and discuss crisis intervention and de-escalation strategies. And so these are the objectives. So the hope is that we're going to increase your knowledge of how and why a behavioral health crisis occurs. We're also going to review and discuss strategies for approaching a person in crisis in safe and effective ways, awareness of de-escalation strategies and science of de-escalating conflict. And we're going to practice identifying the feelings, behaviors, and physical responses individuals experience when they enter a crisis state. Also, we're going to increase your ability to assess the needs of individuals in crisis and the role of mobile crisis team members in crisis intervention and de-escalation. So how we're going to do this is you're going to go on a journey with us today, right? We're going to go through this, learn crisis intervention and de-escalation with a scenario. And, crisis intervention is dear to my heart. I've been working in crisis intervention in various capacities, so super excited to be here to share experience along with my co-presenters. Super excited. So today's journey, this is what it's going to look like this morning, right? So we're going to be examining crisis and behavior. So we're going to do a quick introduction around defining what crisis is, what behavioral health crisis is. We're also going to be discussing and recognizing how to intervene in this process. And we're going to be using the escalation cycle and community response as a guide to take us through this progression and integration of de-escalation strategies and skills. And we're going to be guiding. We're going to be using this particular case scenario, which you're going to meet Jackson in just a few minutes. We're also going to be closing with post-action support, sharing resources. David talked about additional training that you can actually get. And we're going to talk about some resources available so you can actually do that piece as well. And then we're going to close with an opportunity for question and answers. Throughout this journey today, this morning, the next couple of hours, with the invitation is that you share information. I already see the chat is very active. And so we're inviting you to ask questions and also participate in any of the ponderings that we're going to be asking you this morning as well. So that's the invitation for today. As we look at the next slide for crisis, right? So a couple of aspects of crisis, we know that they tend to be unexpected. They create uncertainty and fear because there's a threat, right? A threat to physical safety or something the person holds valuable to. And then we have another aspect of crisis in this particular definition that you're seeing in front of you is that whatever the person in crisis was doing before, it's not working. So there's a need to do something different. So there's a change process that needs to happen. And the aspects of crisis can also be very scary for not only us as the supporters and responders, but also for the individual that's experiencing this crisis as well. And so change, we know that it can be difficult for some and it's necessary. And so for a behavioral health crisis, there may be additional aspects, right? This definition talks about, maybe some experiences might be running out of medications or being overwhelmed by other aspects of their life. But it's, one of the pieces that we know that for us as supporters, our response is really important, right? We need to figure out how to best support this individual. So the invitation is to also think back about the last time that you worked with someone who was very upset and agitated. What caused them to feel this way? We're going to stay on the definition on the last slide. So what caused them to feel this way? What did they do in response to you or attempt, right? What did you try? How effective was this? Did the situation, did it get diffused successfully? Did it escalate? Or another person of this may have to know that we don't know other reasons or precipitating factors that escalated the situation for the individual as well. And we also know that when someone is extremely annoyed, angry, or afraid, there may be other factors that happen and towards the person, or there's a situation that's causing these feelings. So they enter in the space with pain and distress, right? So there's in the next slide, we can, start to think about this as an integrated experience. So what is the power of positive behavior as we're looking at crisis, right? So this definition earlier, we talked about, there's an event, there's situations, there's a crisis, there's precipitating factors, and a crisis can impact the way an individual responds, but it also discuss how we as supporters can help the individual recover quicker, right? The de-escalation process in this situation, it's really important for us to really be aware and be prepared. And our behaviors, again, and our attitudes can also impact the individual in crisis. So this particular definition here is the power of positive behavior. So the integrated experience really illustrates the way our behavior influences others, right? So you may have encountered this in your professional and personal life, that when we demonstrate negative behaviors, we may likely notice that others will follow, right? So how many times in your personal life you may have said something may have happened and you may have said, oh, maybe I should have said something different, or I should have approached it a different way. And so we can change the narrative by influencing our own behavior and turning into an asset. So basically what the integrated experience really helps us understand is that our own behaviors as supporters, as responders, we can change and influence the situation. So look at this, if you're looking at this particular equation here at the bottom, right? So if there's imbalance in the way that we're responding or we're feeling, we may increase the escalation. But if we have balance, we may support the de-escalation process, right? The other aspect about the power of positive behavior is that this particular integrated experience supports trauma-informed practice because you're more mindful about your approach, right? You're thinking about how am I showing up for this in this space. You also become more person-centered, right? So you're really thinking about the individual, what's really impacting and really understanding. And David talked about this earlier, is that this is an introduction to de-escalation strategies. And so what we're going to be doing is integrating best practices throughout. Some of these are going to be adapted from the CPI training for those that are familiar with that. But it's not a CPI training, so we'll talk about that later on as well. Next slide. So one of the things about de-escalation and preparedness and community response is that we have discovered so many different pieces. There's a lot of research behind the strategies that we're going to be utilizing today, or exploring with this process. And that what we know is that coming into a crisis situation can create a lot of feelings for our supporters, as I mentioned earlier. And really understanding our own behaviors and thoughts and feelings offer us to stay grounded in the experience. So it's really important for us to be aware of our own dysregulation and how that may impact others in crisis. We also know that there are precipitating factors that escalate behaviors. So people in crisis often experience a loss of power, and there are more other reasons, right, that we don't know that tends to escalate a situation. But our awareness and really knowing that the individuals may be activated by precipitating factors is really important, right? So it's not always related to their diagnosis. We're thinking about the person first. Another discovery in the research as well is that we know that verbal and nonverbal skills help to stabilize the situation. How we say what we say matters in a situation. We're going to go through these nonverbal and verbal approaches to help and support the diffusing a situation. The other piece too is that you're not alone in this experience. And so really utilizing your resources is going to be something that we're going to be talking about later on as well. And as well that we know that every crisis situation is very different. And you're going to use all of these different skills in different environments, and they may look different based on where you are, if you're in a public place or in someone's home. But again, it's really utilizing those resources that are going to be very supportive in helping you to de-escalate a situation. Okay, next slide. The other piece is too, why is this so important? Why is de-escalation and the research and information so important? There's so many different benefits about what we talked about, what we're going to talk about in the next few couple hours. And so, as stated earlier, these research-based skills and practices really help us, again, to remain person-centered. We keep the individual in crisis in mind. What they're experiencing and how we can support them during a crisis as well. We're also bringing our own knowledge and experience of trauma-informed practices and shifting the focus to what's wrong with you to what happened to you, what's going on, what can help to create that, what helped to create this feeling right now, and how can we best support you in this process. And so what we know is that even though some of the trauma factors may not be, they're beyond our control, but really acknowledging the 3 E's of trauma, which is the event, the experience, and effect. It really helps us to build trust and promote healing and pave the way for positive recovery as well. We also maintain a positive and professional attitude, right? So we want to be able to maintain control of the situation without overreacting and being proactive to supporting the individuals. And then also not taking negative comments to heart and remembering that a lot of times the individuals may be reacting to a situation and they be reacting towards you, but it's not a personal situation, right? So it's really important for us to disconnect and have that rational detachment and having the ability to control your own behavior so that it's not taking personal, maintaining that positive, composure and attitude and supporting that individual as well. And so we can't control the other situation. The external pieces, we can control what ourselves in the situation is in the process. The next slide shows us the escalation cycle that we talked about earlier, right? So since your primary responsibility as a mobile crisis team member, it's really to improve the presented mental health situation of the individual. So we must be able to address all the mental health concerns strategically and sequentially, right? So some of you may be familiar with this particular escalation cycle. And this was developed by Colvin and Shagai in 1989. So the escalation model, you notice here, there's the time and there's intensity on the side, right? The individual's response is connected to the activation, and sometimes it can, escalate pretty quickly depending on the situation, the activation, the trigger that's going on. And also, all of the stages are very important, but the recovery stage is often times not given enough credit, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to pause for a second and have you kind of think about, and write in the chat the invitation, where can we actually intervene as responders? What would be a prevention aspect for us? Where can you pinpoint, right? Where can we start this activation or the prevention aspect for us as supporter? When triggered, acceleration at the aggression point, right? Yeah, as responders, we can actually do some prevention work there, right, in the acceleration, process. Because oftentimes when we're called out to a location, we don't know what happened, right? The individual's already escalated. So see lots of really great ideas here, right? So as the acceleration happens, right, there's that peak, and oftentimes this is when we get called out to support the individual in crisis. One of the other aspects too about this particular cycle is that the recovery stage is oftentimes not given a lot of credit, right? Because we get to the location, there's we provide the services, the intervention, and then we want to move on to the next thing. And oftentimes the lessons get lost, right? So, but this is a really important aspect. And this is one of the pieces that we're going to talk about as you get to meet Jackson in just a second, is that if we close out this de-escalation experience or intervention is closed out well, we can prevent it from coming around in the future, right? So this is some of the pieces that we're going to talk about also. So Sydney, introduce us to Jackson.
All right. Thank you so much, Angela. So Jackson's perspective is going to be shared as we go through the different steps of de-escalation. And as someone who is coming in as a service provider to provide support, remember that on the other end of those calls is someone who's likely been navigating some sort of internal battle long before you got there. So as we're looking at Jackson's perspective, I want you to consider how our approach and the steps that we're taking may have an influence on his inner dialogue. So Jackson has lived in a 6-bed residential home for 10 years. He has been living there since his mother died and does not have the resources to live on his own. And so we're going to be going just based off of this information alone.
All right. Thank you, Sydney, for introducing us to Jackson, right? So we're going to meet him. We already met him. So as you receive the call, right, you receive a request from a local adult residential care home manager for a resident named Jackson. The manager tells you that Jackson is angry, agitated, pacing around the home, and making threats to kill another resident who keeps taking his personal belongings. Staff had not been successful at calming him down. You're told that Jackson has lived in a residential home for many years and he's diagnosed with bipolar disorder. The manager informs you that unbeknownst to her, the resident who was threatened called 911 and has told the manager that police officers are on their way. All right, so let's take this to the escalation cycle, right? So as mentioned earlier, the de-escalation preparation begins as when we receive the call, right? So we talked a little bit about having a plan in place helps us to lead to a successful resolution for the person in crisis and those that are connected to the individual, right? Mentioned earlier that oftentimes we don't know what happened in that acceleration, that agitation, but we kind of have an idea with Jackson, right? So as you're kind of thinking about some of these pieces, what are some of the considerations, right, that we need to do for planning for the call? Okay. Next slide. So as you're planning for the call, you may be asking yourself some of these questions, right? So the invitation now is that let's kind of talk a little bit through this conversation, right? So you're planning, what do you think seems to be the essence of this crisis? Write that in the chat. How do you decide the team composition, right? We know there's a strategy in place. Who is the best fit for this call? Some other considerations might be roles of each team member. What plans might you create with the residential home manager? How might you prepare for this mobile crisis service? Is a diagnosis a relevant factor in the escalation here? What would be your next step? Consultation, right? What plan do you make for checking back with your teammate? Okay. So somebody mentioned here in the chat, the other resident stealing his property. Right, that's the initial agitation, right? The activation that we're thinking about. Any other thoughts, any other considerations as you're preparing for the call? What else would you think about? Right. So we're going to stay with the safety, right? So safety is another aspect as well. Does he have a history of violence? There's some of the things that we're going to be considering. Okay, so let's talk about team composition, right? We see other information in the chat as well. Other considerations might be, how are the other residents affected? Okay. Great considerations here. Any weapons? That's another aspect that we're thinking about. All right, so the big one would be what type of residential home it might be. And that's another consideration. Is it one which primarily houses mental health clients, IDD, physical disabilities, right? So these are really important considerations that we're thinking about as we're strategizing going out to support this individual. Okay, let's start it off with like team composition. So as you may know from the BIN, teams can be composed from a variety of service providers, right? So in the next slide, we're thinking about who's going to carry out these services. What type of experience does each team member hold? Are there any special skills required for this response? Right? Teams can also be further diversified by race, gender, culture, community. Somebody talked about that in the chat already. So what kind of community are we going into, right? The totality of home residents, any residents with other crises in the group home as well. Okay, so let's take us to the next slide to talk a little bit more about team composition. These are some of the other pieces that we're thinking about, right? So as we're strategizing and preparing for the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about strategic planning and how can we support the de-escalation process, right? So when we're thinking about the team composition, who's going to do what? Somebody already talked about it in the chat. Where's the de-escalation taking place, right? In this situation, Jackson's in a residential home. And then we're thinking about, you may encounter differences depending on the environment that you're in, the community, somebody already mentioned, safety factors, as somebody mentioned as well, right? So we're also kind of thinking about the way that we're going to be approaching the aspect as well is when we're arriving to the situation is we're going to talk a little bit more about nonverbal cues later on today, but it's important for us to think about how we're going to be showing up with the open body posture, eye contact, and we'll talk about some of those aspects also. So we can go to cross systems collaboration, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about why, the strategic planning is really, really important. But then also thinking about who else are we going to be receiving these resources from, right? So earlier we talked about you're not in isolation in this process. And so it's important recognizing some of these cross systems collaborators in this process. And so using your resources to de-escalate a situation is very key, right? So every time a system or cross systems partners are involved in a crisis event, we want to also think about how do we engage those partners effectively, right? I see the chat going, and we're seeing lots of really great considerations too. I'm going to pause for a minute. Any life stressors that might be impacting his mental health. Okay. Medication compliance, that's another aspect that we're thinking about also. We're inviting you to keep those considerations going in the chat as well. And so when we're thinking about cross systems collaboration as well, we're using our partners our resources, right, to de-escalate the situation. But it also sets the stage for strong partnerships. We're developing mutual trust, and it can also expand the de-escalation skills of those partners as well, right? So later we'll talk a little bit more about this in depth, but when we're going into a particular location, we want to also, when we leave, we want to make sure that they have the capacity and the skills to de-escalate a situation so that we're not called out again, right? So that's another, aspect or benefit of us really supporting and utilizing our partners when we're going out into different locations. The other aspect too is if we just go to Jackson's home and only focus on him and help him to de-escalate, but if we don't really connect with the staff, if they're escalated, what's going to happen when we leave after, right? So same is true if we go into a home with a child. If we fail to address the experience of the parents or the caregivers, we want to make sure that we're supporting the individual, but everybody around them as well. Those are the additional resources also. Somebody mentioned in the chat that they used to work in a residential home for 3 years and had a lot of training to deal with aggressive and overwhelmed clients. So that's really, really good to have that additional training and being prepared in those aspects. So Cappy's going to take us through a couple of pre-deployment tips on strategic planning, and then also sharing some best practices around how to organize the call.
Great. So yeah, when we get this call to go mobile, of course, we want to be moving quickly, but we want to take a few minutes to do all of this pre-planning that Angela has talked about and use our drive time to really do some consideration of some of the factors that you have put into this chat here today. What's happening with the staff, not just with Jackson, but what's happening with the staff, to consider the subjective experience of all of these players. The staff that are in the facility and Jackson, and what's happening perhaps with the other residents in the facility. And somebody mentioned law enforcement. What's their thinking as they're heading to this scene? When we get these kind of requests and we see all these multiple parties involved, what do you think? Are their subjective experiences and priorities the same or different? Are Jackson's priorities the same as the staff? Are those the same as law enforcement? No, they are different. They each are have their own sort of, bringing their own business and their own priorities to this intervention. Are their subjective experiences each legitimate? Are the experiences of the staff legitimate? Are the experiences of Jackson legitimate? Important for us to pay attention to all of those. If I'm standing in the shoes of this staff person, what's going through my mind as this situation unfolded? As law enforcement are coming on the scene, what's going through their mind? As Jackson is awaiting all of these parties, what's going through their mind? So based on all of this information, we want to really understand as best we can, get some proxy understanding of each of their subjective experiences and priorities. And Daniel, I see your chat. What is a legitimate subjective experience? It's kind of a trick question. If someone's experiencing it, it's legit, whether it feels legit to us or not. If in their subjective shoes they're experiencing it, we want to view it as legit, and to kind of build some empathic understanding of that. Who are these other parties that are going to be present? And we want to be paying attention to where are we going to start as we're approaching this residential home. Who are we going to begin with? What's our best guess on how we're going to start? Through all of it, we want to be centering the involved individuals, not just Jackson, centering him and his perspective, his legitimate concerns, but also centering the staff in our mind, also centering law enforcement in our mind, so that we are prepared to do this complex, multiple party type of intervention, and to be managing different experiences and different priorities throughout sort of the whole of this, with Jackson at the center, but all these important other parties as well.
Alrighty, so now we're going to take a first glimpse at Jackson's experience through all of this. So I hate living here. Nobody respects my belongings or personal space. I hate having to share a space with someone different every other week while I'm stuck here day after day. This new resident never leaves me alone. The staff here doesn't listen to me when I tell them about this person stealing from me. They only listen when I make threats. The more extreme the threat, the quicker I'll get what I need. All I want is for my things to be left alone. It shouldn't be like this, but what choice do I have when nobody listens to me? So from the perspective of somebody experiencing a crisis, it can be harmful to make assumptions about their reaction without considering all of these little things that is going on in Jackson's head. And granted, this is just one of many experiences and one of many perspectives that somebody can be having when you're supporting in crisis. So it's important to just keep that in mind, that somebody is not solely their diagnosis, and there's a lot more that we don't know behind the scenes. So it's really important that we're considering all of the possibilities and all of the things and asking those questions and thinking about what we want to ask before we get there, so we can gather as much information as possible and be as supportive as possible. And while this reaction may be very, very extreme and threatening to harm somebody, Jackson may not have the tools or skills to be able to manage the situation any differently. And he's also shared here, it feels like he's not able to get any sort of response unless he makes these extreme threats. So he's found a way to be able to get his need met. And ultimately that is making these extreme threats. And this outlines the potential experience that Jackson may be having, and it considers a continuously unresolved issue and operating solely out of frustration and not having what he needs.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney and Cappy. And also in the chat, you're already getting into the groove of like, what are some additional pieces that you want to be considering, right? So someone mentioned he wants to be listened to, not just heard, right? So looking at that first person, really looking at Jackson and what he's experiencing, and what Cappy mentioned around like the legitimacy of what's happening for him, it's true, right? So that's his own experience. And also thinking about cultural considerations. There's somebody else put that in the chat, and we're going to talk about that later on as well. So all of these pieces are really coming together. Somebody's also mentioning here, likely Jackson may be feeling a loss of control in his life, and the theft of his property is something that's legitimate for him, right? So he might be feeling, even though we're just imagining it, we can feel our own empathic understanding rise, and this will help us stay in person-centered. Thank you, Cappy, for we're writing that in the chat, right? It's really staying centered for that individual. So we've already arrived. We just kind of jumped right in, got to meet Jackson. We got the call, and we are on our way, right? Cappy mentioned as you're driving, you're thinking about all these strategies and planning and who am I going to talk to first, right? So your partner, having those conversations around who's going to do what, right? So you're getting prepared. You're getting there. You got there. You got to the location. You arrived at the hospital. You see a chaotic scene outside. Police officers interviewing a man near the cruiser. Another's talking with a woman on the porch on the side of the house. You see a man that's pacing, agitated and yelling. A woman is telling him to calm down, right? So we might be thinking that, who's this person, right? So you're already arriving at the scene. So let's look and see really quickly around the escalation cycle, because we're going to be bringing this back and forth. And so again, you've arrived at a location, the escalation has intensified. So it's getting to that peak, right? You're past the acceleration cycle. And usually around this, with this particular, in this cycle, in the stage, the individual's experiencing either yelling, maybe they're refusing to calm down. They may not want to talk to anyone. They may be non-compliant. right? And so as we're thinking about these intervention tips, we're continuously planning in this process, right? So what are some considerations as you're arriving to the location? On the next slide, we have some considerations, right? So some of you had already started to, kind of bring up this information, right? As far as like, what would be the next step? Who are the essential parties that we need to engage in? Right? The invitation is to write the answers in the chat. Like, who would you, essentially connect with as you're arriving, right? So you have a few different cross-system partners there already. What team members are going to take what roles, right? What order do you approach the parties in? What might you do as a team? What might you do as an individual or separately, right? Yeah, somebody wrote in the chat, worked at it disappeared. Find out law enforcement, who is who, right? Initially connect with law enforcement. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody has to leave. They have a crisis call. Get a report from law enforcement on the scene around safety factors, right? Then move on to the next thing. So everybody's like on it, right? So what, some of the pieces that we're going to be thinking about. Initially want to speak to the facility staff or law enforcement just to establish a timeline on what is currently going on, getting that information. Next, we want to speak to privately with the client and really listen to him, right? So there's that strategy that's taking place. The chats are just kind of going really fast. So I'd like to see everyone who is at first and could identify with Jackson's frustration, but I would want info if there are household staff as well. Speak to the facility staff that are called, right? So lots of really good connections there. Okay, so in the next slide, we're going to bring back this cross-system collaboration slide and just kind of reminding around, like, once you respond to a call, everybody's already like writing that information in there, but just a quick reminder around being purposeful, right? So when you get out to the facility, making sure that you're connecting with the senior leadership first, right? So who are we going to connect with? You want to make sure that you want to get that information, but it's really important to get connected with all of the different pieces so that, again, somebody mentioned in the chat, getting that timeline, getting more information, right? They can also be, connecting to cross-system partners can also give us an awareness of the actions that have been taking place already, communications, what staff have been involved in the situation. And we also want to make sure that if we're going to be creating the safety plan, like there's going to be a follow-up, right? Okay, so somebody wrote in the chat, check in who is the point person at the facility, team strategies. Gosh, everybody's on it. Love it. Love the feedback in the chat. And so again, we want to make sure that we're looking at patterns, establishing that rapport, right? So we might not see these individuals again, but we might be called out to the same location again. So it's really developing that rapport that we talked about earlier also. And really looking at having that situation controlled. And once we leave again, we want to make sure that there's that follow-up support that Jackson's going to receive or another person in crisis, right? So making sure that there's going to be that follow-up. Utilizing your tools and resources are really, really important. You can do your best to plan the car, but can change when you get there. Absolutely, right? So you have a strategy in place, but the other thing about crisis is being flexible is another aspect about the work that we do, right? So flexibility, utilizing those resources, those tools that you have as well. It's really important on that. All right, so other ones, let's talk a little bit about law enforcement on the next slide. Want to make sure in this particular situation, law enforcement is already there, right? So we talked about this as well. And in the chat is that you want to make sure that the roles are identified for each party because they may be in the middle of interviewing and want to ensure that there's not any crossover or interruption around what's happening. And then also identifying who's going to be taking the lead on the de-escalation, right? Consistently following up on the status of interviews are really, really important. What needs to take place next, as you mentioned earlier, I mentioned in the chat, right? So things can be shifting pretty quickly in a crisis situation, right? So being flexible, information is constantly changing and emerging as you're, doing your interview process. And also, as everybody's ready to close out, we want to make sure that we're connecting with law enforcement if there continues to be any safety concerns that are still emerging. How do we mitigate those pieces as well? So that's another important aspect. The next slide talks a little bit about just some recapping of what's already been said. So we want to make sure that we're establishing that rapport with partners. Another example, right? So we talked about this earlier, that some of these interventions may look different depending on the environment that you're in. So an example, if you're in a school setting, you want to make sure that you're connecting with the principal, or in a community, who is a leader there, who's taking that lead, and having those connections are really, really important. And also making sure that you're taking that consensus of who's going to have that connection. And, asking for permission if we can actually, connect with Jackson at this point. Somebody already mentioned it as well. Is it a safe environment, right? So we want to make sure that we're aware of the have situational awareness and making sure that it's a safe environment to approach. Is there a safe place to meet with Jackson? The location's really, really important as well. So Cappy's going to take us through some strategies on how to engage partners.
Yeah, and just following up on a couple of points. When we go to the principal's office, or when we engage the senior person in the facility, we're also making sure that they know. We can actually get in and out of a facility without a manager even knowing we were there. And we want that manager to be aware of it. We want them to understand what's happening, because they are best equipped to be doing follow-up and make sure everything sort of kind of comes back in place in-house after we leave. So it's a really important element. I also want to call out Jacob's comment here. He says, immediately jumping to talking to staff in front of the client can actually be invalidating. We might want to explain the process to the escalated individual first, and then gather collateral information. I think that's a really important consideration. And in this kind of sample, kind of starter conversations, I do a little bit of a hybrid, which is basically an introduction to the staff and then permission to go talk to Jackson. We'll circle back to staff again. So some example questions or statements to the staff. Oh, wow, we can see you have your hands full here. When you have a minute, because they're talking to law enforcement, we'd like to introduce ourselves. We were asked to come to the scene by so-and-so. We might say, are you familiar with our agency? Are you familiar with these mobile crisis services? Do you have any quick updates about what happened or what is happening? How is Jackson doing now? So not the deep in-depth thing to have Jackson over there saying, oh my gosh, they've added to their forces, because we don't want to be viewed as an extension of this team at the home that he's already frustrated with. We certainly don't want to be viewed as an extension of law enforcement, but we do want to be deferential to the staff who are the authority on site, and they'll be the authority when we leave. And we also want to acknowledge kind of their role here. So we get that sort of brief permission with them. And we may, based on what's happening and what's happening with Jackson, we may also say, I'm curious, how are the staff doing? We might describe that the purpose of our service is to support Jackson in crisis de-escalation, problem solving, planning. And then we like to consider with him and with you any sort of options, treatment options that might make sense. But we're also wanting to pave the way that this is a resolution-focused intervention. So we can say, often things are resolved well enough that people can stay where they are. So we're sort of setting the stage for that potential outcome. At the same time, we might say, do you have thoughts about what you'd like to see happen? How does he relate to others in the home? And then say, we would like to talk to Jackson, and then circle back to talk again with you. How does that sound? Is there anything else we need to know? ahead of time. It's collaborative. It's engaging them as credible, capable, intuitive people here, and viewing them as just really essential partners in this all coming together. Law enforcement, same thing. Of course, we get there after them, and so they're already actively doing some things. So we're going to just saunter up, get a little closer. When you have a minute, we'd like to introduce ourselves. Again, how it is that we came here. Are you familiar with the services? Here's what we would like to offer to Jackson. Is this a good time for us to engage Jackson? Or should we wait until you have finished your work? Because we don't know the status of their investigation or even the nature of this threat yet to know if there's some legitimate law enforcement piece that they're going to be following up on. We might say, is there anything else we think you should know? Maybe he has outstanding charges or probation violation. We might say, do you anticipate that he'll be arrested or face charges? If it's indicated, do you have any concerns about him leaving for treatment services? And finally, hey, we'll touch base with you if we're ready to leave first. And could you still do the same? So we're just kind of opening that line of communication. Somebody says, I like that we are a resolution-based intervention. Lorinda, I'm glad you like that. That is it. That is one of the primary differences in this bin and really important kind of component for us to be sharing that with our system collaborators out there.
All righty. Thank you so much, Cappy. Now, at this point, the crisis support team is there. Law enforcement has been notified. Now, let's take a look at what's going on with Jackson. All these people are useless. They called the cops on me, and now this escalated way farther than it needed to. I wish someone would have just listened to what I was needing. Now, everyone is just scared I'm going to hurt someone. I don't understand why things must be this hard. I'm mentally exhausted and angry. I feel like I'm being treated like I'm incompetent and my needs don't matter. What's going to happen to me now? I don't want to be arrested or hospitalized, but why else would they call these people? They just don't want to deal with me. I just wanted someone to listen. Yelling and causing a scene seems to be getting everyone's attention. So there's a lot of things going on with Jackson now, and maybe seeming a little bit more escalated at the initial arrival of everyone coming up on site. So what else are we noticing? He's also expressing still not feeling heard, and some sense of intimidation and worry now that he's seeing law enforcement there. He's starting to wonder, okay, now what's going to happen to me? This feels a bit extreme, and expressing some sense of hopelessness as well, and also some frustration with the folks around him and not being able to get the support in-house that he was wanting, and that external folks were needing to be called. So overall, still feeling very frustrated with how this was handled.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm just reviewing the chat here and just kind of reiterate some of the pieces that are highlighted here. It may not be completely possible in larger cities, but networking and doing introductions with facilities prior to crisis occurring goes a long way to streamlining the process when it does happen. Same with your local law enforcement. What a wonderful idea, right? It's really connecting. We talked about the partnership building earlier. There's some other pieces here that my chat is just
filling up with great stuff. It's hard to keep track.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff going on. So definitely the resolution-based intervention is such a great hit. Keeping your ideas as a crisis worker going into a situation, or at least ready to pull out into a snap to see medical or law enforcement, right? So it's just keeping that the ID, like the role, right? So reinforce the negative attention. Sadly, talked about the making those connections as well. What has been his past experience with law enforcement, crisis in the house? That's another great consideration, is to really think about those pieces also. Asking if he has an ally on staff, case manager, then see if that person could be present for him to keep moving forward. What a wonderful idea when we're starting to think about the safety planning, right? So those are some of the pieces that we're looking at him, right? So asking him to join in, right? Join in and making those connections. And so as we're thinking about all of these pieces, the planning, right? Somebody mentioned earlier, we can do the best that we can to plan to get to the situation, right? So we have arrived, And now Jackson is sitting in a private area on the back porch, residential home, and the young woman who you know is a staff person is watching him from across the yard. So this is the individual, right, that we saw from far away that was escalating. He's still clearly upset, pounding his fist on the table and yelling about him being mistreated, right? So Jackson says to you, so you've already made those connections with the partners, you're approaching Jackson, and he says to you, there's no reason for me to meet with you. I'm the victim. Why am I in trouble? I have rights. She, the residential home staff, had no right to make me leave my room and call the cops on me. They never believe me. That is how those staff are in this place. You just can't trust any of them, right? So as we're thinking about the approach and we're going to, connecting with Jackson, on the next slide, we think about where is he at in the continuum, right? So we're bringing back this, the continuum, the escalation cycle, right? So he's in that space where we're going to be providing this intervention. And again, just a quick reminder of how the individual may present, right? So they may be still aggressive, screaming, yelling. We notice that Jackson is pounding his fists, right? And still very visibly upset around the situation. And so one of the aspects around this particular intervention is also, again, having that situational awareness and maintaining a safe environment for the individual, but everybody else around him as well. And when we're thinking about these considerations, like what are some of the pieces as you're approaching Jackson that you can think about, right? So let's look at some of those considerations, and the invitation again is continue to write, some of the pieces. How would you approach Jackson? He makes a statement. How would you approach him? Right? Are there any mental steps you're taking? Right? Cappy mentioned this earlier. We want to remain strength-based, right? Are there any stories you have about Jackson, right? So the first thing that we talked about, the medication, any other additional stories, right? Somebody mentioned in the chat, we want to validate his experience, right? He's going through the situation and validation. Are there any nonverbal and verbal approaches that you may employ as soon as you're approaching him, right? Yeah, letting him know he's not in trouble, at least not by the crisis staff, right? Those are some of the pieces that we can think about. Any other considerations? How would you start the conversation, right? So those are the things that we're thinking about. Being open, making it clear that you don't know the whole situation and want to hear his side of things. What's going on for you? Speaking to him, not because he was in trouble, but because, he's going through this experience, right? Listening to his concerns and frustrations, where he feels he's successful and what he feels like he's good at, so that we can highlight his strengths as well. Introducing your role. Very important. Like who you are. Cappy mentioned this earlier, right? What does this experience look like, right? Those are information that individual in crisis may need at the moment.
I'll just add that is especially important to be describing your role if you have not had this type of resolution focused crisis team historically in your community. And if historically a team came out only if they were doing like a 5150 evaluation, it's really important to sort of explain how this team is different than teams that they might have experienced in the past.
Yeah. Trying the level of power dynamic and validate how difficult it must be to have a bunch of professionals surrounding him when he feels he has no agency and is not listened to. Again, going back to that validation and that experience for Jackson, right? Identifying your role and the differences between, being a therapist and not law enforcement, right? So really, really important to notice the distinctions. Okay, so lots of really great considerations, right? What are some verbal and nonverbal approaches you might employ when meeting him, right? So some of you wrote it in the chat, learning more about just connecting with him, right? And so we also noted that in the escalation cycle, he may be at a peak, right? So verbal intervention is really important for us to be really aware of. Okay, so the next slide, if we can just go to the verbal intervention. So these are some quick review of different strategies that you can use in approaching Jackson, right? And so the focus for this particular section is to integrate the crisis intervention, right? So when we're in that de-escalation stage, we're using these de-escalation strategies. And so these are the use of techniques, including verbal and nonverbal communication skills that are aimed to diffusing anger and stopping aggression, right? So these are all of a set of techniques that we're going to go do a quick review of. So we have listening skills, empathy, verbal and nonverbal communication, validation that somebody talked about already in the chat. And we're going to be employing all of these different skills to supporting Jackson, right? So again, this is not a CPI training, but I think this might be familiar for those that have taken the training. And these are some of the principles, right, that we're going to be supporting the individual with. And so coming in calm, right? So these are some general pieces. Being calm enables you to develop rapport with the individual, right? So we're connecting with Jackson, the validation, the support, the asking questions, the role, identification as well, and avoiding mirroring them, right? So we don't want to, connect back to that same energy, because the goal is to really support and get them to the space of recovery, right? Again, we're thinking about safety in the de-escalation situation. We want to remain composed, right? So that we can begin the conversation and, thinking about Jackson, how do we connect, right? Isolating from the environment. So Jackson's already in a location where we can actually talk to him confidentially. He's away from the situation. And we're utilizing and employing active listening skills, right? So it's another great tool to utilize. And it offers them an opportunity to feeling heard. Somebody talked about that in the chat as well. He wants to be heard. That was one of the initial comments that were that was integrated into the chat as well, right? So we're going to talk about some nonverbal cues later, but utilizing some responses such as or I hear what you're saying, right? So it's a brief invitation, right, to connect into the individual, making sure that our nonverbal cues, again, our body posture, giving people space, right? Somebody talked about cultural considerations earlier. And so space is such another aspect that we have to be consider and be aware. There's a space limitation for folks. And even when you're going to sit next to someone, it's always really important to make sure that you're asking for permission. Can I sit next to you, right? So having all of those pieces in place are really important. Consistency is another aspect as far as verbal intervention as well, with your words, your tone, and your cadence, right? Sometimes all this clinical jargon may confuse individuals, so it's really important to just stay consistent, right? So individuals in crisis listen to us with fewer words, right? So in that stage. So active listening, we're going to dive a little bit more into the active listening, just to kind of have a little refresher around that piece. On the next slide, active listening, we know that it's a way of listening that involves our full attention. We want to wrap this individual with attention, right? So it's really, the purpose is to understand. Sydney talked about this earlier also, is that in understanding Jackson, we want to make sure that we're giving the individual or Jackson our full attention. Later on, Cappy's going to demonstrate some skills that are useful skills that we can utilize in this process in active listening, right? So we can use paraphrasing, right? We can, talk about silence and reflection, and again, validation, right? So how they feel and really connecting to them as well. Nonverbal, somebody talked about listening empathically, right? So this is a great segue to the next piece there's two pieces around listening, right? So we have active listening and empathic listening. And they both, require our full attention to attending to another person fully, right? So really understanding them. But empathic listening puts us in a special emphasis on understanding their emotional experience, right? So we mentioned this particular piece around like it's a legit experience for them, right? So really are connecting with them as well. The key elements for empathic listening that somebody mentioned in the chat, again, is being non-judgmental. We're offering our genuine, acceptance of the individual, giving them our undivided attention. Jackson doesn't feel heard. We want to support him in this process, right? Focusing on the feelings. And again, silence and reflection are also skills that you can use in empathic listening and restating to get a clear picture of what's going on, right? What are some of the goals for empathic listening? It's one of the things that we're looking for is, again, we want to get a clear picture of what is happening from their perspective, right? So what need is not being met? There's a need that something happened. Somebody talked about this earlier in the chat where Jackson's items were stolen, right? So not being heard. Minimal encouragers, head nodding, hums, right? Like I'm role modeling that right now, right? So what is the need that they haven't met, right? What are some of the important facts to the individual? You are the core of what they're experiencing. We're staying again, person-centered, right? We're going to help them problem solve. That's another goal, finding new ways of addressing the situation. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about nonverbals, right? I'm just kind of reiterating the chat, validating his feelings, reflective expressions, low sounds, right? So as we're thinking about our nonverbals and the tone of our voice, right? Low sounds are helpful. This particular quote really summarizes nonverbals very well, right? So what message do we want to start with? We talked about that earlier. Nonverbal behavior sends a powerful message. Often the first impression you make is based upon how you look. The challenge is how to make that impression useful in the service of crisis intervention. Right? What a powerful quote, right? To talk about how we show up in this space is really important, how we can support the individual. Asking questions for clarification and more depth of answers, right? Those are really, really important. So now let's talk more about nonverbal intervention strategies, right? We mentioned this before that the more the person's in distress or in pain, the less they hear your words. And so the more that they may react to our nonverbal communication, right? So being aware of silence, somebody talked about that earlier, right? It can be very helpful, but too much can be very intimidating or creating a lack of interest. We also want to be aware of our expressions and eye contact. Cultural considerations are also very important here, right? In a lot of cultures, eye contact is not supported as much, right? So also being aware of our neutral facial expressions. Those are the best really to build that rapport with the individual. Modulating our eye contact throughout the intervention. And individuals in crisis may react to eye contact differently, like I mentioned. So it's really important to make sure that we're doing that. Somebody mentioned in the chat that they try to wear neutrals or even soft colors when heading to a crisis, which doesn't seem to be critical, but has helped in 2 cases, I remember. Wow, what a great insight, right? Very, very important. Being mindful of our gestures, facial expressions. Too much, right? Too much can create a whole disconnect with the individual in crisis. It's really important for us to be aware of that. So there's a balance, right? And somebody talked about this earlier, which is the head nodding and positive facial expressions, so that we're conveying the attention is on them and that we're there to help, right? So really being mindful of that. We talked about this earlier with body language, making sure that our tone and body language are neutral. That goes a long way. I talk with my hands a lot, so I try to like make sure that I minimize that if I'm in a crisis situation. So making sure that keeping your hands visible and using control, like movements, are really important. Your body posture, position are also very important because we want to convey that we're present and we're also calm and supportive, right, in that piece. So, Cappy, take us through some scripts that are helpful to support and nonverbal interventions.
Yeah, and Jenna just puts a note in that says, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And so tying all of this together, the work that you did building the empathic narrative on your way out. Of course, we don't know the whole story, but we can try to get an empathic understanding of how Jackson is feeling so that we feel empathy towards him. We're ready to get there. We're very curious about how he thinks. And it's that mental model that then predisposes us to use these productive approaches, like being aware of silence, being aware of our posture. It has me bring in an opening ear. It has me get curious rather than getting directive, or rather than setting, kind of getting directive. So all of that empathy work pays off because it predisposes us to use these productive, relief-oriented techniques. And I am then predisposed to ask this person for whom I feel empathy and for whom I'm viewing in a strength-based way. I'm predisposed to get curious and to assume that he is credible, capable, intuitive, and able to collaborate, and to assume that he has pressing needs that he can articulate. So I am putting my priorities aside, right? I have some other priorities. I probably have some paperwork I have to fill out, some mental status stuff, some assessment tools. All of that gets put to side. He's in crisis state, and my task is to engage and de-escalate. And I do that by giving him sort of the power to speak what is most pressing for him. So I am asking things like, what is happening? What happened earlier? Say more about that. Many of you talked about, these short sort of cues to have somebody continue. Tell us more about that. Tell us more about not trusting staff. Affirming, that sounds very upsetting. Your feelings make sense to me. What do you have a hard time trusting? And then this is an interesting twist. What do you think the staff do not understand? Gives us some interesting insights. Maybe he says something like how hard it is to live here. We don't know. We'll never know till we ask the question, and the answers will surprise. But my interest here is that Jackson feels seen, heard, listened to, and understood, because it is relieving to feel seen, heard, listened to, and understood. It allows Jackson to take a deep breath. So you can see how these questions can get used to identify Jackson's most pressing issue. And he is the only one that knows those. He is best equipped to articulate those because he is credible, capable, and intuitive. And he can tell us as best he can. And we just bring the empathic understanding that it feels safe to him to do it. We've helped him sort of shift back into his executive function brain. So he's best equipped to tell us that. And the emotions and the activity in his limbic system sort of calm down. As he's had a chance to take a deep breath, I can go a little bit further to try to understand that bigger context that so many of you have brought up in the chat. How is it that you came to live in this home? What has your experience been like living here? What's the hardest part about it? What are the things that you like about it? When do things go best for you in the home? Questions that are Socratic, questions that require executive function to answer, right? It's helping him move into that sort of productive problem-solving space. And he is now, predisposed to give us some introspection.
All right. So at this point, we've arrived and we've started connecting with Jackson. So after we've practiced all of these de-escalation techniques, let's take a look at how he's feeling now. At least these people are listening to me. Nobody ever lets me share my side of the story. I like how these people will listen and talk and let me talk. I still don't trust them, but it feels good to be able to vent and not feel judged. I don't feel the need to yell right now, and I feel calmer. So drastically different than what we've seen before once we've been able to start practicing those de-escalation techniques. He feels calmer. There's a realization that he's able to be in a position to be vulnerable safely with others, and how the staff are interacting with him are playing a huge part in this as well. I remember seeing that in the chat somewhere, is it's not about what you say, it's how you say it. And I really appreciate this last comment, Jenna, that you just left. And it really just embodies that the value of voice and choice of those we're supporting. They are much a part of this as possible. We can come in with all the plans and all the intent that we want, but at the end of the day, it's their life, and putting them in a position to help support in making those decisions is extremely valuable, and is going to be the most sustainable solution to all of these challenges. So thank you for that.
And I'll just add one more comment before flipping it back to Angela. Now that, you might be wondering, well, when do we get to the evaluation of the homicidality, right? Like at some point that becomes important. And it is, but it becomes important when he has de-escalated, when we've really sort of put him first and his pressing needs first. And now he's up in executive function, having felt heard, listened to, and understood. So once that has happened, then I can move back more into the assessment mode and say things like, can I ask you more about what happened this afternoon? And can I ask you more about the statements you made about killing another person? And how have you been feeling lately? And then move my way in there because it feels safe to do that. If that's my first question out of the gate, that's going to be an escalator and feel mistrust. When I time this well, now we're going to get sort of his best accurate evaluation of what he's really experiencing and just what this homicidal ideation is about.
What a perfect segue, Cappy, around this experience, because now you've used all of these de-escalation skills and getting into that assessment component. So you put all those in practice, and now Jackson is much calmer. His motor agitation has settled. He's engaged with the team. He's listening and expressing his thoughts and feelings. And he says that he doesn't want to kill the other resident and never would, but he's angry at him and very tired of living in the residential home. There's no privacy. People keep getting his things, right? So now we're getting into the conversation because he's actually able to have this conversation with you. So it's really nice conversation. So in the next slide, we're starting to kind of think now and know, right, that we're going to get we're transitioning into the recovery stage in that process. So he's more calmer. He can actually discuss more questions with you, right, or conversations, as Cappy mentioned. And so where do you go from here? Now that we're transitioning into this recovery phase, what are some additional considerations that you can think about? Right, so we're going to get into that evaluation that Cappy was mentioning. There's somebody in the chat, again, the driver's seat. They just need help remembering how important it is on their own role in crisis resolution. Yes. Okay, what considerations might you employ next, right? Continuing, what strategies do you continue to use in the conversation? What cues are giving you the opportunity to indicate that he's ready for a resolution? All right, there might be some additional strategies that you may be using. Asking, what would you like to see happen? Motivational interviewing skills, right? So you're going to be employing a lot of different skills here. Asking them what it would like for him to feel comfortable moving forward. For example, setting boundaries with his roommate. So you're starting to think about some of the problem solving, right? So the safety planning, the problem solving, what are some pieces that we're going to be doing with the next stage? right? So let's talk a little bit about that piece of collaborative problem solving, right? So we're going to be determining what the next safe step is for Jackson, right? Choice, always choice. Love that. I like to let the individual know that I will validate their choice and their decision process to move forward and whatever safety looks like for them, right? So what is the next safest step for them, right? Recognizing that, we can't force individuals, just like Adrian mentioned in the chat, but what is it that they want to see happen out of this whole situation, right? Giving them choices, using those trauma-informed principles when you're offering the individual a sense of control, right? That's the other piece too. Some of the key elements, additional pieces to consider is making sure that somebody mentioned it earlier, right? So offering some clear, simple, and brief suggestions for the next steps. Do they agree with these steps, right? Are they realistic and comfortable for them? Right? Sometimes it may be necessary for us to repeat some of these steps. Right? Those are really, really important. See if we come up with a game plan for how better manage these issues in the future, right? So you're having to start these conversations with them. Any other considerations? Okay. Well, Cappy, take us through some approaches that we can consider here.
Yeah, and the comments here are, again, fantastic. We are doing a very collaborative approach here with Jackson. We don't have the kind of authority that the group home staff, for example, the residential home staff have, for example, or law enforcement, and we're doing field work. So anything that gets into sort of over limit setting is problematic because it's really not our role, and we don't want to get in a power struggle with Jackson. We still do want to get some insight there, if we can, around what's going to happen if it keeps going down this path, without saying, if you keep acting this way, you're going to lose your home, right? We don't want to take that approach. That's going to start the escalation cycle all over again, and we will have been the ones that started that cycle this time. But we might want to get at things in sort of a roundabout way by asking things like, I'm curious, how do you think the staff are feeling about today? And do you have thoughts on what might happen if you make threats again? Do you think it's likely that would happen, that you might make threats again? Do you have any ideas that would make you feel safer and less worried about your belongings? So we're really asking him to be the generator, and for him to say, oh yeah, I do know, because I was already told if it kept happening, I was gonna, XYZ was gonna happen. So we're really wanting to help him sort of internally bring it up in a kind of a constructive, forward-thinking, problem-solving way, but not doing something that is directive and overtly limit-setting, that would either feel threatening, make him feel less safe, or actually cause sort of an escalation of crisis state. There certainly are circumstances where we think things are serious enough that hospitalization is needed, and maybe even 5150 if he did not agree with hospitalization. But we are going to continue to be person-centered, collaborative as far as we possibly can, so that any next service is really a collaborative decision between the two of us, as many times as that can happen. So I might approach that again in a collaborative way. Based on what happened today and how you're feeling, you do make criteria for hospitalization. I'm curious, have you experienced hospitalization before? What was that experience like? What made it helpful? Did anything make it hard? What would you think about going to the hospital today? Are there other ideas that you have considered, or that could be considered instead of hospitalization? And sort of based on his answer, get curious again. If he says, yes, I really do think I need to go to the hospital, I can go further. Say more about that. What are the good reasons? Or if he says, absolutely not, bad idea, same thing, go further with him. What are the good reasons not to go? Tell me more. Listen to what those things are. See what kind of can be maybe negotiated. And even say something like, even given all those good reasons not to go to the hospital, can you see any benefits? Our goal, if he gets hospitalized, is that he goes with his own consent. He goes in not in crisis state, and he goes in more open to what that care experience is going to be if he gets there. So even when it gets to sort of these tough decisions like hospitalization, we want to make it as person-centered and offering him as much control as we can, kind of moving around that way.
Right. So at this point, we've sat with Jackson. We're asking him questions. We're practicing active listening skills. I feel a little better now. I'm still angry that things had to escalate this much, but my body feels calmer. I can breathe now. I didn't realize talking it out and having a calm space and presence could do that or be helpful for me. I'm just tired and frustrated more than I am angry. I don't feel heard here. I don't feel like my personal space is protected here, and I don't have anybody to talk to about it. I wish more staff responded the way these peer advocates did. Things never would have gotten this bad. And this could be peer advocates or any particular person that's responding in that moment for the and the crisis response team. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that he's able to self-regulate, and he's able to kind of reflect back at his actions of the day and kind of the thought process and his feelings and emotions around it. And he's reflecting on what he was needing in the moment that he wasn't getting that kind of led to this escalation. And recognizing what he needed from others is a huge thing here. He mentions here, I didn't realize talking it out and having a calm space and presence would be helpful. So he's able to kind of reflect on that and have the space to kind of, just play out the last few hours or moments that kind of led up to this crisis.
Thank you, Sydney and Cappy. Just kind of been monitoring the chat. And so as we're thinking now, so we've organized all of our strategies using our de-escalation skills. Now Jackson is calmer, right? But you look towards the house and see the manager and staff member are talking and appear to be still upset and shaking about what happened, right? So we're going to take this back to the integrated experience that we talked about earlier and how crisis will impact everyone around the situation, right? So what do we do next? What are some of the things that we do next? Now we have Jackson we're getting him to the point of developing a safety plan. He's in that, getting to the recovery component. What do we do next? What are some considerations, right? Talking, sharing concerns can be so powerful in giving a release of tension for a person in a crisis. Yes, right? So some considerations that we're thinking about here, other factors that may contribute to Jackson escalating again. Somebody mentioned it in the chat that maybe talking about hospitalization may be an escalation experience, right? So that might be something we consider, right? Letting Jackson know that you're going to talk to staff to see if they can get them to understand better what he is dealing with, right? That's another consideration. We're starting to think about safety planning, staff education, physical environment, right? Involving the residential home staff in that safety planning. Cappy talked about this earlier. We talked about this cross-system collaboration as well, right? Once we leave, how do we know that the individual is going to be supported, right? So talk to the staff about their perception of the situation, compare past similar experiences with this individual, definitely. Ask them what kind of outcome they are hoping for. So we're going to be validating staff feelings, thank them for calling, and remind them of the legal criteria for an involuntary hold. We're going to talk about some of those pieces in just a second. Okay. Safety planning with the client, see if they would allow staff on the safety planning, right? So again, choice and really involving them around this experience. Really good pieces here. Okay, so we know that if we're connecting this back to the integrated experience, right? So we're working with Jackson. We're also working with the staff. So let's talk a little bit about how do we support individuals, the person in crisis, and others, right? In the next slide, we know that this support is really, really important, right? So we're thinking about once the escalation has subsided, right? We're thinking about the tension reduction phase, and there's a decrease. We know that there's a decrease in emotional and physical energy. So folks, in this particular situation, we know that the staff are still agitated. We know that Jackson is actually getting to that point of reduction in this physical and emotional energy. And so it's really important for us to support the person in crisis, right? They're in control now. They're able to talk to us about the facts, about what happened. They may be able to see patterns, right, in the behavior, right, in problem solving. We had some ideas in the chat around what are some strategies that we can do to support, him escalating again in the situation. How do we keep his belongings in a safe place? And we can negotiate an agreement with certain, behavior and future behavior as well. And so providing that support and encouragement. And so why is this important? It's important because we want to be able to teach and they can learn, right? So we're thinking about the collaborative process, problem solving, also the reduction in future calls and escalation. We also want to support them in strengthening their relationship, right? So helping Jackson to really seek out and be an advocate and connect with staff as well. The other piece too that is important for us to support in the post-action recovery as well is that we want to both parties to have closure around the situation. That's really important. So let's talk about why it's important for us to support others as well, right? So everyone must be in control before discussing the incident. So we know Jackson's already in that stage. So now let's focus on the staff also, so we can start to think about that safety planning as well. And then again, we can exchange information about the facts, right? So are there any patterns? Or how can we, patterns for ourselves, right? Somebody in the chat mentioned earlier that they get a lot of training in some of the homes or experience that they've been in. So it's really good to have those opportunities to get the training. There's also ways to prevent future future escalations, right? So those are the pieces that we're thinking about. And then also agree to any kind of future efforts, right? And express trust and respect, right? Somebody talked about that in the chat as well. Thank you for calling. How can we best support the situation, right? Just really having that piece. And so why is it important for us to talk to others or whoever's involved in the particular crisis? It's again, to have that integrated experience, to teach, to learn, to strengthen the team, right? So there might be some new staff that are in the experience, or working with Jackson might be a different experience for everybody. So it gives an opportunity to strengthen the team and also to have closure, right? To make sure that when we leave, no one's escalated again. So there's an opportunity for them to have that recovery aspect also. Okay, so Kathy, take us through some scripts on how we can provide some of this post-action support.
Yeah, and already great ideas in the chat, and I'll just add to those. But key to this is that we cannot talk him into what to do and expect it to work. So instead, we really want to consider the collaboration. And notice as we go along how these approaches have been both idiosyncratic to Jackson. This is Jackson and his experience. This is not kind of McDonald's franchise. It's not going to look the same during every one of these interventions. So what we're having is very specific and idiosyncratic to Jackson, and it's iterative. Pieces are coming together logically. So the tension reduction strategies are kind of next logical steps with Jackson based on this content that he has identified. And we are now just building on it. I'm curious, what good ideas do you have, Jackson, for feeling safer in your home? What ideas do you have for what you can do when somebody takes your things? And I'm curious, when you are stressed, what kind of things calm you down the best, or who are your best resources? The things that strikes me so much about doing this kind of work is how often the solutions are so very humble. And Jackson might say something like, if I just had a place to lock my valuables, then I wouldn't be worried about who's in my room. It could be that simple. It is often that simple. And suddenly there are some, kind of easy sort of pathways to go down that become very, very doable and obviously a whole lot less dramatic than hospitalization.
All right. So again, from Jackson's lens, I feel better, but why does the group home staff still look upset? I didn't hurt anyone. I don't understand why I keep painted to be the bad guy. That's a relief the officers are leaving. They were never needed in the first place. Their presence felt intimidating and insulting that the staff felt it was even needed. I guess I made some scary threats, but I didn't mean them. Cappy said something earlier about not wanting to address the homicidal threats too prematurely, because when you're first getting there, you're wanting to just solely listen to Jackson and understand what he's feeling and what's going on. If you have too many discussions prematurely, you're not going to have a productive conversation. And so now that he's able to calm down, he's able to reflect back like, okay, I made some scary threats. I could understand now how that could have been scary for the different staff here. And there's also some relief with the officers leaving. It can be very, very intimidating for some folks, for officers to be there, or for anybody in any role to be there, even for just the crisis response team. So even when we're approaching with our badges, when we're wearing certain things, we talked a lot about, our nonverbal communication. How we're presenting ourselves to folks in crisis is very important, and any sort of system involvement, regardless of your role, can make an impact. So we're starting to see some sense of a relief and some acknowledgement of the consequences of his actions and how that has impacted those around him.
So Jackson is pointing out that the staff seem to still be upset. And hopefully I'm sorry, were you finished, Sydney?
Yes, go ahead. Okay. Sorry.
And hopefully we've been noticing that as well, right? And I love the comments that we're seeing in chat. We see now we have some unfinished business with the staff. And it's really important because ultimately when we leave, as Giselle says, the staff is still going to be there with Jackson. And Jacob says, I would ask if he would like support in summarizing the events with the staff. All really good questions. And even before we get to summarizing the events, we may want to check in on the subjective stress of staff. In the beginning, we touched base. We got permission to go see Jackson. We said we'd circle back around. And we do now want to really be able to circle back around and take some time to also get a feel for the empathic understanding that the staff has of Jackson, because their presence or absence of empathy has an impact on how they are engaging him, not just around this event, but around the broader events. But I'm going to start with these suggestions are sort of starting with the staff and what their subjective experience has been. So I might say something like, what was the experience like today for you and your team? Homicidal threats are scary, right? When you're in a staffed facility. I might say, have you all had a chance to catch your breath? And I'm probably really speaking with the management team here, knowing that this is sort of like being on the airplane and you put the oxygen mask on the grown-up first, and then they put it on the child. It's sort of the same here. We're supporting the manager, helping them sort of de-escalate, and then they will then do the same for their staff and other residents. So we're not having to go around and debrief an entire set of staff. But I might say, have you all had a chance to catch your breath? They have a chance to talk about that. And now, again, I want to do some empathic exploration. I'm curious, how is it that Jackson came to this home? What has his experience been living here? I'm asking them to put themselves in Jackson's shoes and come up with that empathic story. When does he do best? In what circumstances does he struggle? I might ask, what do the staff struggle with the most when they work with him? What approaches work best? And then kind of coming back around to one of Jackson's ideas, I might say, Jackson mentioned that a locked drawer would help him be less worried about his belongings. I'm curious, is that something that's possible? Or are there some other things that are possible? And if the staff take a stance, let's get curious. You'll often find that you've kind of stabilized things with the person in crisis. Staff is still escalated and they might still be taking a stance. They might say something like, he can't stay here, or he needs to go to the hospital. And if that happens, we don't want to just dismiss it and go. We don't want to just say they don't meet the criteria and leave, because if we do that, the staff remain escalated. So we want to get curious again. If the supervisor says Jackson needs to go to the hospital, I try to be very person-centered. This credible, capable, intuitive staff person thinks hospital is a good idea. I want to get curious. Say more about that. What are the good reasons for Jackson to go to the hospital? Let them sort of speak what's on their mind. I'm curious, has he been hospitalized before? How did he experience it? I'm curious, do you think he had a good health benefit the last time he was in the hospital? Right? I'm really wanting to explore that so they themselves can come around to some less restrictive alternatives to hospitalization. I'm curious, are there some alternatives that are acceptable to you and to us that might help Jackson feel safer at home and decrease the likelihood of another incident, and maybe let us put off the idea of hospitalization? Our goal here is consensus with Jackson, consensus with staff, and a kind of consensus plan between the two of them.
All right, thank you. And so now we're getting into the space of safety planning. So we're going back again to our cross-collaboration systems and supports. We've already had some conversations around how to connect this safety planning, right? So, Cappy, there was a question in the chat around, like, is it within the scope to take care of the stolen property? Like, how would you respond to that particular question?
Yeah, I like Jacob's response there, or I might facilitate a conversation with Jackson about that with with the staff. Jackson is curious what might happen now, but I agree it's largely not us taking the lead on that.
What additional considerations are we thinking about in safety planning, right? So we've had some conversation around that. And so the pieces around that we're thinking now that we're close to the recovery, close to closing the response, what services are you available to provide once the situation has stabilized, right? So those are some of the questions or the considerations on the next slide. And we're thinking about basic needs. We're talking about, are there additional referral arrangements, right? What are the warm handouts that we're going to be providing, right, to Jackson in this particular situation? Is there going to be a direct linkage? What are some additional considerations that you're thinking about, right? Often facility staff are consumed with fears and historical outcomes. Sorry, the chat just keeps going. Protective factors, support systems. That's another great consideration, right? So what are some pieces? We know that he doesn't have external family members, but are there additional protective factors that can support him in the process, right? Support that experience. Any other considerations that we're thinking about really are connected back to creating that safety plan and resources that he may need for additional, follow-up. On the next slide, let's talk a little bit about, Cappy's going to mention some additional strategies for staff and family, if there's, additional considerations as well.
Yeah, so now we are doing what was recommended up further. Now that Jackson's de-escalated, we've had some conversation with the staff, they've taken their breath, we've introduced the possibility of solutions, and now we can bring them kind of together and give people a chance to share that. So Jackson has some ideas for feeling safer in the house and managing his feelings. Jackson, do you want to share those thoughts? And then manager has some thoughts about what might help. What ideas did you have, manager? And then I'm curious, which of these ideas could go into a safety plan? Which of these things do you think you could all pull off? And are we missing anything important here? And does this feel like a plan that could work? I can't tell you how often the safety plan gets pulled out as sort of this separate, oh, by the way, we need to do a safety plan, right? And we miss the opportunity to capture this kind of evolution of thought and idea, this iterative discovery that's happened throughout our own intervention, and really the humble plan. Lock on his drawer, talk to X staff person, use whatever kind of word or language that they've all agreed that he can use if he's feeling overwhelmed. It's humble, it's useful, and most importantly, it came organically out of this intervention.
Alrighty. So I feel like I'm in a much better space to voice my frustrations now that I was able to talk it out with someone. I hope they're going to hear me out this time. I don't like escalating things, but I just feel like I don't have a choice when I'm not being heard. Having someone who will listen, empathize with me, and support me with my concerns instead of brushing me off feels most supportive for everyone involved. I don't appreciate the judgment, being ignored and blamed, and being spoken to like my opinions and feelings don't matter. Nobody would. So at this point, once Jackson's able to be a lot more calm, he's able to have some of that self-reflection of kind of the whole experience and really values empathy and someone being able to just sit and talk with him. And as simple as it sounds, sometimes it really is just that simple. Someone being able to hear you and hear your concerns. And he's even able to acknowledge directly the things that he didn't appreciate by the staff that he was there with, being brushed off, feeling like he was being judged, being ignored, being blamed, things escalating when it didn't need to. He's able to identify and reflect back on those experiences now that he's had the opportunity for somebody to listen to him and hear him out with his experiences.
Thank you, Sydney. So we're going to take this back to the beginning again. And we talked about the escalation cycle, right? And that recovery stage. A lot of times I mentioned that we tend to forget about that stage where it's very useful in us to also debrief ourselves as a team, right? So we talked about post-action support for the person in crisis, for the individuals, the systems that were part of this crisis as well. But then we also, it's very beneficial for us to also have that experience to debrief with us as a team, right? And some of the pieces that we're thinking about is how soon after an incident can you debrief with staff, right? What factors should we consider in deciding when debriefing should take place? What can you do immediately to improve your debriefing or communication with individuals in your care? What can you do immediately to support your own experience during this crisis response? Any other considerations as we're thinking about, we wrapped up this call, we're going back to the next call or to our offices. So these are some things to consider, right? Really important for us to think about those aspects. On the next slide, we're thinking about what are some aspects around post-action support for our teams, right? So these are some recommendations and strategies that you can use, right? So we call it review, respond, and remind, right? So reviewing is what actually happened in the situation. The response is like, how do we respond as a supporter, team member? And then also the reminding of what we do for ourselves, right? So in the review process, how did it go? How did this response go? What was effective about this team composition? Should we do something different next time? Should we keep it the same? What was the use of the mobile crisis service for Jackson? Was it useful? Was it helpful? How do we reevaluate, right? Did the mobile crisis service go as planned? Sometimes, right now we went through this beautiful journey this morning and it went as planned, right? Sometimes they don't. And what happens in those situations, right? How do we, was it helpful for us to involve others? Did the collaboration go as planned? I love how somebody beautifully mentioned earlier is that you want to make those connections earlier on. I always say that the magic happens in the connection, and if you're not connecting, there's no magic happening, right? So it's nice to have those connections with folks right before you get called to a crisis, right? So having those connections is really important. How did it go for me as a supporter responder? What was the easiest? What was the hardest part of this whole process, right? And the response is how has this mobile crisis service affected me? Right? Sometimes we know we have multiple pieces going on. Is there anything that I need to debrief that significantly impacted the outcome for Jackson? Right? So we talked about that integrated experience earlier, being aware of our own emotions, right? So, and if I do have some response to the situation, is there someone that I can reach out to? Who do I talk to about this, right? And the other aspect is reminding you, right, that the work that we do is it's a hard work, right? So not hard, but heart work, right? And there's also emotions connected to that as well. So reminding you to take care of yourself. How are you going to do that and detach from the situation, right? So those are the really important questions to ask. And why we do this, we come up with some really beautiful learning opportunities as we're debriefing and we're going out into crisis work. On the next slide, we talk about why it's important to debrief what worked as a team individually, right? That's very, very important. We also want to track interactions that are going to support and expanding the work that we do, right? So improve supervision, supporting the individuals that we work with on a daily basis, right? The last one is a big one, right? So we want to make sure that we're also supporting individuals on the team because there's research behind debriefing, supporting, right? All of those pieces creates job satisfaction, right? So we want to prevent burnout. Those are some of the aspects that we connect to this debriefing model or process that's really important. And we're going to remind you, right? So talking about, burnout, right? So we want to remind you that it's important work, in the crisis experience that I've been part of. After every particular situation, I debrief the responders or the team members. And sometimes they don't want to talk to me. And I just say, hey, humor me. Let's just talk for a couple minutes and let's just have a conversation around what happened, right? That's really important. Questions for you as you takeaways for today. How can you prevent burnout, right? Those are on the next question, on the next slide, some of the questions to reminding and expanding. How can we manage it by being intentional about the work that we're doing, right? So we're constantly revisiting some of the pieces that we're doing. How might we cultivate new practices to enhance our outreach approaches to our clinicians or peers, right? It's really, really important to do that. And as we summarize all of this today, on the summary slide, we covered a lot today, a lot of information. David talked about this also, right? So we had a lot of information. And there's some learnings that we're going to summarize, right, for today, right? So the crisis de-escalation, we talked about this integrated experience. We also talked about being aware of all different types of precipitating factors that support our understanding of what a person in crisis is experiencing. Our attitudes can impact the de-escalation process. We also talked about a few verbal and nonverbal communication strategies to support the de-escalation process. Remember, you're not in isolation in this process, so really utilizing your partners and collaboration with other key players is really important of the experience. And lastly, there's no perfection in this work, but we can make it more predictable and influence the outcome by planning our approach. So I know a lot of times you can't plan everything, but it's really nice to have that strategy in mind and having tools in your toolbox to be able to support the work that you're doing. On the last slide, these are additional opportunities. There's a lot of different companies out there that train on de-escalation strategies. And these are just the two leading organizations that offer training to teams. First is the Crisis Prevention Institute, and they're an international leader providing evidence-based de-escalation and crisis prevention training. Since 1980, they've been offering lots of support. And the way that they work is that they have experience in working in different sectors: education, healthcare, human services, and retail as well. And they offer a train-the-trainer model, which gives an opportunity, gives organizations an opportunities to send a few trainers and then come back and train the organization and do training, certifications, but also refreshers so that you can hone on your skills as well. And the other leading organization is ProAct. And they also offer de-escalation training. And they have a set of principles that have been tested widely in the healthcare field, behavioral health field, and residential education settings. And so these are just some of the opportunities where you can, take it back to your teams or your organizations to further explore enhancing skills for the teams as well. And now we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A. So I'm going to kick it to David to guide us through this next stage.
So much, Angela. There was one Q&A that came up and from the Zoom chat that I want to pitch to you experts. One is any recommendation or guidance on whether or not to interrupt a client you are responding to that is tangential and telling a delusional story. Should you let them tell the story so they feel heard, or interrupt to see what you can realistically do to help the client?
It's a very good question. We don't want to be there for an hour of tangential sort of conversation that's not guiding. But I also would not want to assume that the tangentiality is all related to a diagnosis, or that's all symptomatic of a diagnosis. So I'm going to want to do what I can to sort of calm the situation. And part of how I might do that is really concentrating on my nonverbals to really engage and look for sort of brief opportunities to kind of come in and redirect the conversation a bit. I might suggest somebody walk with me to sort of change up the thought. I might say, would it help? Are you thirsty? Can we sort of bring in some stuff? I'm paying attention to all, kind of the totality of what's happening. We haven't mentioned this here, but sometimes somebody is really in the midst of sort of a psychiatric condition that is worsening in this moment. And as we've tried these techniques to de-escalate sort of the crisis state, which is different than sort of the kind of the psychiatric state in the moment, right? Sometimes it's kind of clarifying about sort of the nature of this event that's unfolding as well. But I might say something like, can we take a couple more minutes talking about that? And then can I ask you a couple other questions, right? So I'm going to try a few ways to sort of shift that as I can, but to pay attention to some of our other body language and physical ways and other ways to disrupt if I can. Sydney, did you have thoughts on that?
I did. Thank you. So I think some things to be mindful here is regardless if we as professionals are considering it delusional, it is a very real thing for that person in the moment, even if it is tied to any sort of psychiatric episode, or if they are find themselves heightened. So honoring that space with them and just being mindful of any biases that we're coming into when having that conversation. And then if you find that it is going on too long, the suggestions that, Cappy provided, I think are extremely appropriate, asking if they're thirsty, are they hungry, and finding ways to just interject to transition the conversation, but being very mindful of just any biases and acknowledging that that is a very real thing for that person in the moment.
Yeah, and I just put a couple of things in chat, but feel for the essence for it. Is this fear? Is it loss of control? Is this anxiety? And in my anxious state, I'm in some tangential thought, and if I can help them shift out of that anxious state, I might see some reduction in that. The essence of the crisis for the person is legit, as Sydney said. It's getting expressed perhaps in a delusion. That doesn't mean there isn't still loss of control, fear, anxiety, grief, loneliness, isolation, And so we want to see the person and that very legit experience.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful answers and tips on how to actually join and allow someone to have that space, and noting that it is a very real experience for them, and sometimes allowing them to express what that is for them, and then coming with some additional strategies, meeting their actual core needs. Is it sitting down? Is it taking a walk? Is it getting it moving? Is it how can you help de-escalate that strategy in real time? And then just being really human with the offering of water, food, whatever it may be. Here's a snack for you. And especially in mobile crisis, because you don't know what someone's actual core need may be. And if you can just help give some support in that way, it can really help diminish some of that. So thank you both for those suggestions.
And just kind of one last point here. When I'm being person-centered and I'm trying to understand it from the shoes of the person, I don't have to agree with it. I just have to see it and believe in the credibility of that experience that they are having. Even if it's not clear to me, even if it's not my shared reality, right? I'm feeling for the essence, kind of the human experience that they're having there. And I'm connecting sort of on that regard. So seeing it from their point of view is not the same as agreeing. And that's just kind of another element that allows me to kind of hold these two things at once. But I'm sort of setting aside my belief. I'm seeing the suffering. The distress is clear. And I'm connecting with the distress.
Thank you both. I think you and Sydney spoke to that eloquently, and it's a really valuable tip. So thank you for holding that space. Looking to see if that was all the questions we had in the Q&A, actually in the Zoom. So I'm going to look over and see if we have anything, or welcome you to add any additional questions you may have in the actual chat. That way our panelists can answer them in real time.
There's some other pieces around training, aspects too.
Yeah. Seeing some appreciation for the wonderful panel. Thank you for your work on this and putting it together.
Yeah, well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your morning and afternoon, and happy Friday.